Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello, I'm Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with James Hankins about the problems of liberal learning in our current age and all the many facets of that. I'm honored to welcome James Hankins to Liberty Law Talk for the first time. He is a senior editor to Law and Liberty. He has contributed a number of essays the past year on some of the themes that we're going to discuss today. He is a professor of history at Harvard University. He's one of the world's experts on the Italian Renaissance and the humanism of the Italian Renaissance, and is the author of the much-lauded, highly reviewed book, Virtue Politics, Soulcraft and Statecraft in Renaissance Italy. James, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you.
Just thinking about that book for a minute. That's sort of an interesting question for a lot of Americans, I think, who think about politics. What do you mean soulcraft and statecraft?
Well, I'm drawing attention to the fact that in pre-modern political theory, going back to Plato and Aristotle, thinkers and political actors have attached as much importance to the character and educational levels of the rulers, the ruling class, the elites, as they have to constitutional forms and laws. In the modern world, we seem to try to solve every problem by adding a new regulatory agency or passing some new laws. They were convinced in pre-modern times in the Renaissance, but also I think pretty generally in the ancient tradition, that you had to have good people running the institutions. If you had bad people making the laws, bad people enforcing the law, you weren't going to get any respect from the people to start off with. And things would go bad very, very soon. In my book, I talk about this as a problem of the 14th century, which was addressed by the great founder of classical humanism, who is Francesco Petrarch, who most people know as a poet today, but he actually has a tremendous importance as an educational reformer. So he's the one who invented the whole idea of the humanities as a way of training elites so that they would be people of good character and wisdom and education.
You've written on sort of this idea that Americans can learn a lot from this period, 14th century Europe, 14th century Italy, and sort of general decay and authority. Could you talk about that for us?
Yeah, I think there are some similarities. I mean, of course, it's very, very different, as it always is, but the similarities are the ones that strike me, namely the problem with legitimacy of elites and institutions, and they're combined with some rather remarkable parallels, such as epidemics, which are, of course, 1,000 times worse in the 14th century than they are today, like the Black Death. But the real problem that Petrarch saw, and other people of his time saw as well, that the people who were leading the church and the people who were leading the various states and the Holy Roman Emperor, all of these people were either ineffective at their jobs or people who were corrupt and hard to respect. So the result was that you had a lot of illegitimate power, societies falling apart, tremendous factionalism, which is another analogy with the modern world, a terrible factionalism in the republics of the or the communes, they call them. We call them republics today, but the communes of Renaissance Italy. So there was constant fighting in the streets. Shakespeare did not invent the situation in Romeo and Juliet. He was channeling 14th century history when he talked about the Montagues and the Capulets fighting in the streets. That was fairly common behavior. So we have the same problems of factions, unfortunately not quite as violent as in the 14th century, and we have the same problems of illegitimacy. Not that our institutions are illegitimate, but that the people who are running the institutions don't respect them. We have a great constitution. We have some very fine laws that we have and government institutions, but they're constantly being bent out of shape by people who want to exploit them for their own ideological purposes. But Petrarch's idea was that what you need, and the way it's like, what you need is people who are respect their own institutions and want them to be preserved intact for the next generation. And people understand that institutions have to be maintained by persons of good character, and they have to have a sense of cooperation with people of different backgrounds and different beliefs.
So Petrarch lights on. I mean, we would kind of look to a policy response or a grand political campaign. Petrarch plays for the long game and trying to rebuild education, and that sort of, maybe you could talk about that some. I know you've been talking about it, but also thinking about the general condition of humanities departments today. And you said that some of your pieces too, which I think about as well, which is how much worse it can get, say 20 years from now, as sort of even the moderating influences retire and leave the academy.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that for a while. What the end game is here, and one thing I'm about to write for Law and Liberty is a long piece on what I'm calling ed exit, the tendency now to leave union-controlled public schools behind and go to private education or homeschooling. I've been in touch with some people at the Great Hearts Academy who tell me that the homeschooling population is now over 10% in this country. Of course, a lot of it's temporary because of, but it's growing, and the number of schools that are essentially dropping out of woke education is also growing. Catholic parochial schools, there's a lot of people, the good ones anyway, are attracting many more students. The private schools that have some kind of classical education or standard education are also growing dramatically. So I think that there is maybe an end game that nobody has suspected to this whole problem of wokery taking over the secondary schools. I'm actually much more worried about K-12 than I am about universities. Universities are very faddish institutions that change. I think that the woke revolution, I can already see signs of it weakening around Harvard, because people have suddenly realized that their own subjects are threatened, and no one will read their publications if we all decide to give up on traditional education. Professors don't like that. They imagine future generations reading their work. So if you're a Shakespeare scholar and you suddenly figure out that the Wokerati don't want to read Shakespeare anymore, then you kind of wonder, where's my subject going? Where are my graduate students going to go? How are they going to get jobs? And will anyone remember my name in the next generation if everyone's reading Donna Gephardt instead of reading Shakespeare?
I was going to ask you, in your position at Harvard, what have you seen as sort of the worst aspects of, wokeism, critical race theory at your institution? What do you think is most troubling?
Well, the most troubling for me is the way that the entire institution signed up to take the knee with BLM in 2020 without any kind of. I think they just regarded this as straightforwardly a good thing to do, and many people weren't aware what the BLM organization was about. They felt badly about the George Floyd situation, and this was a way of showing how upset they were. But signing up with BLM turned out to be a little having more commitments than people suspected. So the main thing that's happening now is there's a lot of pressure to hire people who are supposedly going to help us end racism and prejudice against BIPOC people. Last year, I don't think that the top administration is very sympathetic to this, but they like to blow with the wind a bit. Where I think they would probably say they would like to yield to the wind and then snap back into place. That's a fairly typical Harvard thing. Mm-hmm. So the big question that the very few conservative faculty have around here is whether we're going to be Savonarola or we're going to be the witch hunts. Right. So the Savonarola, the kind of fanatical preacher of Renaissance Florence, basically lasted 2.5 years. The witch hunts lasted 50 years. So
Yeah.
So I don't think we can keep up this level of anger and hatred for very long. But there are a lot of demands. I think the most radicalized element at Harvard is the graduate students who are demanding that people be punished for saying things that they don't like. But we haven't had any really bad cases, such as we've had at other universities, of people being canceled for incorrect thought. People have been canceled for behavior with women, which I think is more understandable. But the idea, we haven't had many cases of people who have been condemned for their ideas. It's not the institution that's doing this at that point. It's the graduate students who are trying to get the institution to do that.
Something which I think would be sort of applicable to Harvard or elite prep schools sort of adopting this model as well, from what I'm reading and hearing.
Yeah.
And so they come to school with this sort of already formed in their minds, I've wondered.
Yeah, and it's starting very early. I mean, I have a friend who is he's got a first grader, and they're already have DEI trainers in his grade school. Although I have to say, this kid is very amusing. He's a smart little kid, 6 years old, and the DEI trainer tried to get them to identify something they're good at. Right? Say, little boys, tell us what you're good at. So then the next step would be to get the children to acknowledge that their special ability was owing to white privilege, right?
Yeah.
So my friend's little boy says, "I'm good at DEI." So that kind of flummoxed the teacher a lot. But it's really distressing what's going on in these elite schools. So parents who are ambitious for their kids and normally want to have them in the best schools available or discovering the best schools available are all taken over by this stuff. So, there's a search for schools that are not going to give in to all of the latest fads. And I think what affects a lot of these parents is what they're seeing on the curriculum. I have another colleague who has sent he was looking at the most expensive private school in Cambridge, Mass. Okay.
Yeah.
He wanted to send his kids to the best place. And he decided he was going to check out the curriculum. So he went into asked the English teachers what they're teaching, and he didn't find a single work which was published before the year 2000, right? They weren't reading any Homer, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton, none of that. They're not reading any of the classical works of Western canon. They're reading, books that are going to help them end racism and prejudice against BIPOC people, right? So, I suppose if you're a political type, you don't have any love of literature for its own sake. One author is as good as another. So this guy, who is a European, he's actually he was totally astonished by the lack of education that his child was going to get. So he sent her to another school. But it's kind of it's a real trouble for parents who aspire to elite status for their children, whether they're going to subject them to an elite school which doesn't teach them anything, or whether they're going to send them to some place which maybe is not so well known, but will have better, more traditional standards.
You wrote an essay, How to Build Your Own Renaissance, a few months ago. Help us understand sort of the Renaissance humanism education, and you seem to be saying, and this could serve as a model in some ways, an adaptable model for us today. Could you talk more about that?
Well, I understand that I sound like a historian with a bee in my bonnet. So I've studied one period of history too much and then finding all sorts of patterns that are really not applicable. But I think that the general strategy is the right one that Petrarch develops, is that you have to have a long-term strategy. Because Petrarch started out thinking he was going to have a revolution. He latched on to a guy named Cola di Rienzo, who's the subject of an opera by Wagner in the 19th century. It's actually rather famous first in the 19th century because he was a popular revolutionary. And Petrarch became his kind of publicist. He was absolutely keen on the idea of not taking out the elite and bringing back the people. And he was hoping that this would turn into a revolution. Unfortunately, it occurred at the same time as the Black Death, so that put a kink in things. But also, the Cola di Rienzo turned out to be, a weak read. he ended up trying to be a tyrant, even though he's calling for the return of the people. So Petrarch becomes very chastened after this experience and decides that he has to go in for long-term solutions. One of the things he does is to start hanging out with tyrants. All the North Italian cities have been taken over by tyrannical types in the early 14th century. The republics were all disappearing one by one and being replaced by tyrants. So Petrarch's, I guess the second idea is that I'm going to go live with these tyrants and try to educate them so that they will be into better people. He does this with three sets of tyrants. And he does make some progress in a way, because tyrants aren't all bad in the 14th century. They're not necessarily what we think of as tyrants today. They're just people with illegitimate power. So then his final solution is that he's going to change education. So that's the real problem. It's in the hearts of men, and women too, because the Renaissance movement is both genders. So he's going to spread a new form of education, which he calls the humanities. He's the inventor of the humanities. It's called the Studia Humanitatis in Latin. And the idea is that you're not only going to be preparing yourself for a professional career, but you're going to study a curriculum that's really going to transform you and make you into a better person, a wiser person, a person of practical wisdom, a person who cares about the whole society, has love for the common good, someone who wants to distinguish yourself for virtue.
Yeah.
And that's what he founds, and that's what actually becomes the standard education in Italy by the middle of the 15th century.
So thinking about the type of character that Petrarch wanted to form with this approach, what type of character does our education system form now in those who are at the elite levels?
Well, I'm trying to remember where I read this, but I read an article, maybe it was Theodore Dalrymple, who I quite like, and he's a great fan of his, who says that the type of virtue that modern education wants is for you to agree with principles, so that virtue is signal, but it's not acquired. Being elite means holding a particular set of ideas, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean acquiring character traits. And the result of that is you learn what to think, but not how to think. You end up not developing character because that's not important. What's important is that you agree with a particular set of ideas, which, of course, constantly changing. 6 years ago, no one thought that it was important to affirm transgender people, but that would become a requirement to be a member of the elite. But now it is, right? Yeah. So that sort of thing is what the moderns are after. They're trying to enforce a certain way of thinking. It's very Maoist, basically. It's basically different from what the ancients wanted, what the Renaissance humanists wanted. They wanted people to acquire the virtues and courage, prudence, justice, and temperance. They wanted all those virtues, and they thought they were important for political leaders to have those virtues. And they had a whole educational system built around the idea that you should acquire that kind of virtues. Actually, if you read Aristotle, I'm sure you know that there's a couple dozen virtues in Aristotle's Ethics, and they're perfectly aware of that. But they want to get the character traits that are necessary for people to acquire moral legitimacy. That's the form of legitimacy we have in the Renaissance, because the Renaissance period is one where political authority simply lacks legitimacy. They've gotten power in ways that are not legal, or the legal system itself is corrupt. Or they, in Renaissance republics, for example, there's a kind of formal populism, but the oligarchs are actually running things from behind the scenes, somewhat like the modern America. And so the idea is that if you can get those people who are running things to care more about the whole society, not just themselves, and try to understand everyone in the society, and to give them good leadership and good examples, that you'll have much more integration in the society.
There's also this example, it seems to me at least like the upper level of, say, higher education in America, and then where they go professionally, what they do after that. There's this sense of, we earn this. This is ours by who we are, by what we've achieved, by what we're capable of doing. And it seems to, I think it's spawned an enormous amount of ingratitude, Whereas, typically, which I think you want the people at the top of your hierarchy to have a sense of ownership of the entire society and political order, social order, that they have a responsibility given to them that they have to fulfill. And I don't see that in our current group so much. To the extent they think that way, it's being a part of an NGO or some new cause or something like that. That's how they serve. It's not, like the oil barons or the railroad barons building parks, new schools, seminaries, libraries, things like that. So I thought that as well, and I think that's that would be the outcome of the kind of education that they've been brought up in.
Yeah, I wrote about that a bit in a review I did of a book by Adrian Wooldridge called The Rise. I think it's about meritocracy. I might have forgotten the exact title, but
you did that for
it's about. He is somebody who is dead keen on modern meritocracy. He thinks that's what we need, and all we need should have people effortlessly rising from the lowest to the highest place in society, so long as they get good grades and score well on tests and they're competent and they're able to bring in the goods and so forth. But if they're members of corporations, they improve the profits and so forth. But that's not the kind of elites that I think we need today. I think we need more localized elites who are more responsible to the local population. I'm not saying necessarily a face-to-face society like the Renaissance, but people who are really invested in their local communities. And I've been told by people who live in smaller American cities that still survives in America. If you go to New York and Boston, Washington, D.C., everyone's globalized, right? They've been brought up among other, especially at elite universities, have been brought up among an international population of people. They think globally. Many of them want jobs in NGOs and finance, and they want jobs that are not particularly rooted in any one society. But if you go out to smaller cities, you still find people who are trying to, use their wealth well to serve the community, building parks and all of those things you talk about, museums, and maybe they're not building museums anymore, but they're adding a wing onto the museum here, or they're supporting arts groups, and they are trying to do what they can to support good education. So I think it's not really dead in America. It's just that there's a kind of super elite in America that's very globalized. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it, if you're a global elite, that you would want to have open borders, right? Because all those people are, if you are a global leader, then the entire population of the world is you're responsible for. So you don't want to see any borders between your nation state and the next nation state. They're all, the non-elites that you are presumably managing. One thing that would really help improve the moral quality of elites is for people that tend to be more localized and more deeply involved with communities, more civil society, more involved in civil society, so that there is some kind of integration in the community between elites and non-elites. That's what we're lacking right now.
Sort of a more connective tissue.
Well, it's not only that, but it's also the question of culture, right? Because the global elites have a completely different culture, completely different moral standards, and with the advent of wokery and DEI, that difference has really become stark. And to the extent that those elites are in control of public schools, it creates a real problem for parents, because they have parents who are traditional, somewheres rather than everywheres. They're parents who have traditional values. They're Christians, or they're Muslims, or they just want their kids to be brought up the way they remember they were brought up in high schools, 25 years ago. They want them to have a good education, and they're confronted with this elite that wants to basically brainwash them. I hate to use that term because it's very loaded, but they want people to think a way that's quite different from the way their parents think, and that's very divisive.
As we've seen play out across the country in the past couple of years.
But I think it's also an opportunity. If you let me just say this, because it popped into my head, and I'm always I'll forget what I just thought up. But I think that it's actually an opportunity now that we can try to expand non-unionized schooling, public charters, and all of these private academies that are coming into existence, there's a whole bunch of new school opportunities, these so-called hybrid education, classical schools, private academies. There's a break-off group in the Catholic Church that's trying to establish classical liberal education in Catholic schools, because many Catholic schools are
the state model.
They're trying to approximate the secular schools. So there's a movement now to reform education, which I think is given a lot of impetus by the COVID year and by BLM demonstrations.
Do you see humanities in higher education? I mean, I've had a friend of mine who's taught in political theory for 30 years, saying he thinks humanities are finished in America in the current model in higher education. Do you see it that way, or is that too extreme?
University humanities are a little different from K-12 humanities in that there's more attention on professionalism and less on character formation and acquiring cultural literacy and that sort of thing. One thing that's perhaps unique to university education is you need to be able to measure someone's achievement as a humanist. So that's typically publications, but the type of publications that's going to be valued are ones whose impact is easy to measure. For a long time, when the humanities originally lost steam, in other words, they lost their reforming purpose. It was already in the late 15th century. One of the things that happened was that people started to be valued for their philology, for their scholarship, more than for the kind of moral character they're trying to communicate through the schools. And we see that a bit. The kind of professionalization of the humanities means that we're less concerned with what's going on in the heads of students, and we're more concerned with what our professional community thinks is good and can value, is able to, if you can do a critical edition, that's something, right? A critical edition, wonderful that is, and I've done in my entire life. I've spent my entire life doing critical editions. It's not making anybody any better, except in some very, remote sense. But the real problem with humanities is it got invaded as early as the 70s and 80s by theory mavens, and it began to be the fad to try to apply French theory, Foucault, and so forth to and Derrida and the study of the humanities. And I think recently people have realized that was not a good move from the point of view of enrollments, that there are a very small number of people who want to wear the beret. I call it wearing the beret, like wearing French theory beret at Harvard. But most of the people, there's still a large body of people out there who just want to read these great authors, but they're not being served very well by humanities programs. Belatedly, we have realized here at Harvard that there is this large population of people who want to read the authors, what the authors have to say, right?
Yeah.
They don't want all of this theoretical manipulation of authors and authors who are being essentially silenced or negated by the way that they're read. Zena Hitz, you've met Zena Hitz or followed any of her work. She has a very interesting distinction between primary and secondary reading. So primary reading is where you read the author in the way the author wanted to be read. So if the author wants to entrance you or to inspire you or to send a message to you or just to have you enjoy the beauty of his or her language, then that's primary reading, receiving what the author wanted you to receive. But then there's secondary reading where you try to show that the author's writings demonstrate some private theory of your own or some theory that's popular in the academy, which is great for getting professional status because everyone says, oh, this person knows the latest theories. He's able to apply the latest theories to these texts. But from the student point of view, it's not so popular. There are some students, of course, who play along and think this is great, but I think the majority of the students have voted with their feet. They're doing something else. Our department, I'm a history department, not a literature department, but we have lost enrollments dramatically in the last 10 years. And it's partly what we're teaching. It's also, I think, this was explained to me by my brother-in-law, who is a former high school principal, that what happened in the 1910s, in the noughties, is that history is basically cut out of all of the testing regimes that came in the wake of No Child Left Behind and national standards. They basically weren't interested in adding history to the national standards. And of course, SATs don't test it. Only if you take an AP history are you going to have any of that knowledge tested. So a lot of students simply never got the chance to be interested in history, because if you're a high school teaching to the test and there's no test in history, you don't teach history. So that's one reason why we're losing historians. But I take your point that there's the other reason is that the professors are far too taken up with their own status hierarchies, and not maybe it mirrors in a way the way elites act in general, that they're taken up with their own status hierarchies and they're not paying enough attention to the needs of the students.
Yeah, no, I think that's right in a certain sense. I want to switch gears and just think about politics for a minute. We talked about this at the beginning. So your book, Virtue Politics, one of your contentions that sort of the modern political project, that a firm constitution with institutions could constrain people and induce them to act in socially cooperative, productive ways. And we wouldn't need to think about character or virtue as much because the rules would just keep things going. I take it you challenge that in Virtue Politics in a basic way. It also seems to have resonance in thinking about a lot of things today and what we've been discussing.
Yes, I want to specify that I think that you need both good institutions and good character, that they work together. Yeah. The humanists tended to believe that they follow Isocrates, the ancient Roman or Greek rhetorician, who thinks that institutions don't matter as long as you have good character. It doesn't matter whether it's a tyranny or a oligarchy or democracy, they're all going to work fine as long as you have good character. I don't believe that. Many humanists did. But there are also humanists who understood that institutions are terribly important, but you have to have both. And what happens historically is that there's great interest in improving the character of rulers, which comes out of Petrarch and dominates the 15th century and well into the 16th century. It runs aground, and it's partly because of the religious controversies of the period. And there's a great interest in making people prove their doctrinal orthodoxy in order to be members of society. But there's one thing that comes out of the Reformation is a great distrust of rulers. And the Reformation is the first great super-factionalized period of European history that goes well beyond Central Europe or individual Italian town. All of Europe and European colonies were riven by the struggle between the Protestants and the Catholics and Calvinists and Lutherans. So one result of that is distrust of rulers. We see this today, right? The more factionalism there is, the more hatred of rulers and contempt for rulers there is. One of the results of that was a greater attention to constitutionalism. So instead of trying to make good rulers, the 17th century becomes obsessed with blocking the effects of bad rulers, stopping the worst consequences of having a bad ruler. And one of the worst consequences from the point of view of religious sectarians is that the ruler will force you to believe a false religion, a religion you believe to be false. So you have to stop that. And so the Constitution, one of the earliest forms of constitutionalism is religious freedom. It guarantees religious freedom within certain limits, like Locke's liberalism. A great deal of Locke's liberalism is focused on preventing the state from being involved in religion or making too many religious tests. It's false to say that Locke wanted the state not to be involved in religion, but he wanted a great deal of tolerance within certain limits. You couldn't tolerate atheists, you couldn't tolerate Catholics, but all of the Protestant groups should be tolerated. Puritans and high church people should all get along, and the state had to be set up in such a way. The unwritten Constitution in Locke's case had to be conceived in such a way that was not part of the role of the state to enforce orthodoxy. Yeah. So that would be an example of what the practical aim of constitutionalism was. And it also applies to economics in the 18th century. Above all, there are certain things we don't want the state involved in, but because the state's going to make a mess of it. Yeah. Right. So the focus, I think, throughout the late 17th and 18th century and the 19th century is how do we keep the state from being oppressive? And we do that through law and constitutions. But they're not thinking in terms of, well, that's not quite true, but they're thinking less in terms, I would say, of character. Now, as you know, if you read Adam Smith thinks that capitalism, free economy depends on virtues of some kind. He has a different list of virtues from the Renaissance, but he certainly believes that behavior patterns are very important. It's one reason why I prefer classical liberalism to neoliberalism of a Hayekian kind, because someone like Adam Smith and all the early economists understood that economic behavior couldn't be absolutely free in the sense of, letting people do whatever the hell they wanted. You had to be constrained by social norms. And by good character on the part of people involved in markets. So there's actually I've been writing a little bit about that as well, that it goes back to the Renaissance, the idea of the moral economy, that the way to prevent economic injustice is to try to convince economic actors to behave well and to put the community and family ahead of their private greed. So greed should be turned into something socially useful. There's a legitimate desire to make money. If you have a family, if you want to support your local city, you have all these good things you can spend your money on. It's perfectly legitimate. What's illegitimate is seeking money for its own sake and for power and status and so forth.
I was just thinking, too, what's the virtue politics? What's the conception of what politics is there? What it's for? Well,
it's the idea that the way to reform the polis, right, the state, is you have to pay great attention to education, and that's goes back to antiquity. Aristotle's ethics is designed to go with the politics, right? You study ethics first, so that you know what virtue is, you know what good behavior is, and only when you know what good behavior is can you then try to create a polity which produces good people. Remember, that's Aristotle's highest. The measure of a good polity is a polity that creates good people. And Plato has exactly the same approach. They differ in so many things, but Plato agrees that education is of fundamental importance to the state. As you know, sort of several books of the Republic do nothing but set out its educational system, and the same with the laws, that there's effort to create an educated citizenry as well as an educated leaders. I think what I would say is that education has always, in the virtue politics tradition, is part of politics. Yeah. And in the liberal tradition, I think we tend to think of education as something that's separate from politics. I'm not sure we have the luxury, and that's an interesting question for the modern world, because we have secondary school educators who want, education to be political again. But what I'm saying, I guess, is that there's politics and politics, and what you want from the liberal tradition is the idea that people are learn to choose their own, not to choose their own good, but to make their own decisions and internalize the values of character that get habituated to acting in good ways. You want an education that's going to free people to act well. You don't want an education that's going to terrorize them into believing certain things. So you could say there's a good virtue there's a virtue politics and an ideological.
So we wouldn't.
There's virtue education and there's ideological education, and what you want is virtue education, which sets people free and enables them to be good, rather than ideological education, which is designed to get them to think in a certain way. You can tell the difference. It's a difference between love and fear, right? You terrorize people into believing the correct ideas, or they will be punished. But a good education, as Plato already knew, is one that is designed that uses love, because the educators have to love their students and want them to be free and independent. It's a difference between a mother who is a smother mother, a helicopter mom, who wants to control every aspect of the child's behavior so that the child grows up to be exactly what she wants him to be, and a mother who understands that the child has to choose for themselves at a certain point. They can give them a direction, they can give them good values, good examples, but at a certain point, you have to let the child flourish on their own.
Thinking, just thinking about our own national education history, it occurs to me most of what higher education would have been in this country in, say, 18th and 19th centuries would have been something like, I don't know if you would say it's Renaissance humanism, but would have had a lot of elements of that. I would
yes,
think.
I think that's right.
Just reading of Amity Schleye's biography of Calvin Coolidge and his education at Amherst seemed to resonate with me on that. But then things start to really change and diversify, and education starts to become different and have different purposes, more straightforward utilitarian purposes. And it seems to me now that's largely how Americans think of education generally. It's almost in an economics dimension. That's the most sober way people think about it, which of course instrumentalizes it completely.
Yeah, and that's an old thing in education too. I mean, that's Plato and Socrates and Aristotle's critique of education in their own time. It's their critique of the sophists, right? The ancient sophists wanted to teach young men with political ambitions how to achieve those ambitions, so they would learn speaking ability in particular. They would learn how to fool people and to argue for both sides of the question, get the skill of being able to persuade people to do what you want to do. But I think you're right that modern education at a certain point became much less concerned with character and much more concerned with fitting people to roles in society. I think it starts at Harvard with Charles William Eliot, who was the great transformative president of Harvard. And he of course, was a huge figure and at his time very influential figure at the generation before Dewey. But Harvard had basically standard humanist classical education up until 1869 when he took over after the Civil War. And then he decided, he was a chemist by training, he decided that Harvard should basically give up any type of requirements and let people study whatever they wanted. And he thought that it was kind of, I guess, a educational version of John Stuart Mill, that you let 1,000, flowers bloom, and that people will be happier because they'll be doing exactly what they want to do. That didn't last after his presidency. President Lowell came along and decided to reintroduce some requirements and make people learn some one thing. One of the results of Eliot's presidency was that there was a condition known as the Harvard ignorance, where Harvard graduates you couldn't count on the Harvard graduate knowing anything because they could take any course they wanted. So it was there was no Harvard stamp in anyone, except that you could never rely on them knowing even basic stuff. So the Lowell came along and reversed that to some extent. There was still some choice, but there's also what we call concentration here, which is like a major. Yeah. So you say you knew something, and I'm not sure it's really correct to say that American education has always been dominated by utilitarian instrumentalist purposes. I think that there's always been people around who had a humanistic vision, mm-hmm. and who understood that human beings need to have ethical and moral development and religious belief even, as well as be trained for some purpose. I think it's maybe gotten worse in the period of meritocracy. The meritocracy really takes off after the Second World War. And that's where you start having all of these standardized tests, the goal of which is to displace the old lost elite and create a new elite of people who are good at taking tests, basically, and who will be productive members of society. If they go into a corporation, they'll be most successful at hitting targets and so on. So that I think that the post-war meritocracy became a little bit. That's when you start getting the division between an elite that cares about their own community and an elite that starts to be nationalized and internationalized.
James Hankins, maybe we can end there. Thank you so much for coming on to discuss with us liberal learning, challenges and opportunities in contemporary America, or liberal learning in a time of disrepair. We thank you so much.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Richard.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.